Have you ever wondered why certain weapons always use so much compared to the other weapons? I'm not talking about the gun or melee weapon. Instead, for this video, we'll focus on just solely on the offensive guns. You'll notice that for AoE weapons always use so much compared to those DPS or even beam weapons. But that doesn't say that DPS and beam weapons are weak. Instead, it's just based on condition whether which mission are they fit the best. And this is why in this video, we'll try to discuss what are the characteristics for each offensive gun and see that what can they do the best. So without further ado, let's hop right into it. For starter, we have the AoE weapons. What makes the weapon an AoE weapon is that for their main shot, they have the ability to deal crowd damage as mostly AoE damage. Most of the time, AoE damage from AoE weapons usually are higher than their main shot. That's because these weapons mostly focus on using the AoE damage to deal damage instead of their main shot. Thanks to that, usually AoE weapons have high KPM thanks to they can clear out crowd very good. But in order to reach out to high KPM, their DPS must be sufficient enough to match up to the least amount of damage for the most common enemies you will be facing in the battlefield. As for their weakness, well, most of the time AoE weapon too relying on the AoE damage, which makes them not able to use the gun CO very well, as gun CO only proc effect on the main shot, not the AoE damage. And this is why you can see most of the AoE damage build don't use gun CO at all. And not only that, thanks to the high power AoE weapons naturally have, they usually have low maximum ammo, which is one of the problems that most AoE weapons need to face. After we look through the AoE weapons, we also have the most common weapon we usually know as bullet host weapon. The problem with bullet host weapon is that most of the time they have naturally low damage, but that depends on what kind of bullet host you have. There are two kinds of bullet holes, which is the semi-auto and full auto. For semi-auto weapons, you will have to make sure that the damage is able to achieve one shot. As for full auto bullet holes weapon, their damage will turn out to be very slow, but in exchange that they have high magazine. Now no matter it's the full auto or the semi-auto bullet holes weapons, usually bullet holes weapons have high DPS. Thanks to their own nature and they can proc gun steal very well, they can achieve high DPS very well. But in exchange that their KPM is extremely low because most of the time bullet holes weapons don't have the punch through effect naturally. And last but not least, we have the beam weapons. Beam is a very interesting weapon because compared to the bullet holes and AoE weapon, it didn't shoot out bullet or explosive shot. Instead, it shoot out beam. What makes beam so interesting is that it calculates multi-shot differently compared to other weapons. I'm not an expert here and I cannot manage to explain very well in detail. So if let's say you have certain multi-shot on beam weapons issue, you can try to search on other videos. What makes beam weapons so interesting is that no matter it's DPS or KPM, it will always stand between bullet holes and AoE weapons because the nature of the beam weapon itself, most of the time, they can have the chaining effect or they can hit crowd so easy that it can do crowd damage. So basically, beam weapon had good amount of DPS and KPM. And because of the beam nature itself, even for a kick gun that runs a full crit combination, it is still able to proc the status very well. But this also have a problem where beam weapons is too relying on the gun CO or status chance. If let's say you meet certain enemies like the Juggernaut, which is mostly immune to status effect, then these enemies will eat beam weapons as their breakfast. And so there you have it. Sometimes for certain weapons, it's not just only about which weapons is the meta, because there's no such thing called the best, remember? Certain weapons really manage to become the top pick not because they're very strong. Instead, they just manage to fulfill the certain requirements for a specific condition or missions, which is why you can see AoE weapons always used the most thanks to how effectively it can deal damage not just only against crowd, but sufficient enough to deal against a single enemies. While others they can do their best, but because of their own condition, it struggles a little bit, but that doesn't mean that they are weak. Instead, you just need to think about which condition should you use for. If this is your first time watching, why not leave a like and subscribe to my channel so that you won't miss out any newest contents from me. Why not leave your comments down below if you got any ideas or thoughts you want to share with all of us. And that's it from me, and as always, I will see you all next time. Bye bye!